Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and today we'll be conducting an exploration of New Orleans, the last Old World city. New Orleans, supposedly founded in 1718 by the Kingdom of France at the time, the city has changed hands a few times, being under the jurisdiction of the Kingdom of Spain, the First Republic of France, and the United States. It's a beautiful city, and it's been with us since 1718, but of course they'll tell us that it was founded, so I guess any year in the United States is just not enough time to say that we actually built a city. Or they're just being honest with us in a way. We look at one of the original plans of New Orleans, and we see an incredible star fort structure around it from this rendering, supposedly composed in 1763. Very beautiful, and yet fascinating that there are so many plots of land planned out for structures that don't exist yet. And what was the original function of the star fort that was built around the city? Is it still there? Are there signs of it under the ground? It's very intriguing when we consider the fact that we believe that star forts are a sign of earlier civilizations, and we see no lack of it for this composition planning out New Orleans. How was it that the French knew that New Orleans was going to accede to such an incredible city? Regardless, it's very beautiful, and let's take a look at an 1851 bird's eye view. Now, this is after New Orleans was under the jurisdiction of the United States. And look at this. Very beautiful, well-built out buildings in 1851. And not just the landmark buildings that we'd expect to see. We see beautiful columns, beautiful towers. It's very staggering to consider all the detail that you already see in 1851. It's also interesting that we see that all of these buildings appear to be either masonry, stone, granite, limestone. We see beautiful domes. What exactly to make of this? The official historical account will tell us that in the 18th century, the 1700s, there was a great fire in New Orleans, and that's what necessitated the building of all these incredible buildings. Yet I can't help but consider the fact that perhaps we're looking at the remnants of a true old world city. Look at all the pediments and the columns that are already present. And there's also a lot of strife associated with New Orleans. I know that other explorers have looked at it very closely, and I know they've been amazed, and one could spend all day just looking at this 1851 bird's eye view of New Orleans and just being amazed at the detail in the architecture and all the effort that had to be expended to complete all these buildings. It's also interesting in the fact that we consider that New Orleans is a city that has lost a lot of its architecture over time. In other words, many of the buildings have been destroyed, and we'll be looking at that here in the video to consider some of these beautiful buildings that have been lost. Others are still with us, fortunately. However, considering the entire picture of New Orleans, originally founded in 1718, changing hands from the French to the Spanish after the 7 Years' War, the French-Indian War as it was called in the United States, or in America at the time, and then going over to the First French Republic during the Napoleonic era, and then back to the United States after the Louisiana Purchase in the early 19th century, which is where a lot of interesting world events happened. We look at other pictures of the city and we see the same kind of beauty, the very well built out buildings, the domes, the towers in the distance, and it's quite amazing. I'm also forced to consider what happened to the star fort that surrounded the city originally. Was that just something that was drawn in that old rendering, or was that something that really existed? There are some small star forts that still exist around New Orleans, and yet looking at other renderings, we're no less amazed by what we see with the detail with these incredibly beautiful buildings, these tall obelisks, and all these domes that are everywhere at the same time. Of course, defenders of the mainstream account will tell us that there was ample time, that it all makes sense, that 1718 to now is plenty of time, and of course the fire at the end of the 18th century is what necessitated the construction of all these buildings, and it was apparently no problem. And there's even another explanation, the fact that this was supposed to be a prime colonial city for the French. Okay, it makes sense, and yet it sure seems like the French let go of the city, along with the entire Louisiana Purchase, rather easily, despite the fact that Napoleon was in charge. Oh well, make of it what you will. Looking here, we see the beautiful cathedral that we'll be taking a look at later and examining in full detail, and the St. Louis or St. Louis Cathedral, however you want to pronounce it. Supposedly under control of both the French and the Spanish did renovations to it. The French originally built it. It's been added to it. Has a conflicting account with it. Also look at what you see here, though, right off of the Mississippi with some of the beautiful and well-developed buildings. Now, of course, we can always say that these composed pictures could have been done at any point in time, and that's very true. And any artist can paint whatever they want to, or they can depict whatever they want to. So does this necessarily prove anything? The answer is no. But it's very interesting to consider that either this was someone's imagination, or they were looking at something that was real and they were interpreting what they saw as real. What year did it really happen? Well, we know how many conflicting accounts that we have in the 19th century. If you've watched this channel before, it's quite an intriguing premise to consider. There's never any shortage of things to see where it comes to Louisiana and New Orleans. We see the depiction here of the cathedral, and is this really a picture? Is this some sort of sketch picture? It's hard to say. It's certainly not of the best quality. And yet we see other painted pictures where we see the same thing. Domes and towers in the distance, and yet a very well built out waterfront. What exactly is this reflecting to us? It seems to be showing us that New Orleans was a very well built out city, and that's one of the reasons why I opted for the last old world city. There's a lot of evidence that New Orleans was perhaps the last fully intact old world city before it was altered over time. If we go with the five eras theory as our primary theory for what we're considering with the presence of previous civilizations that we're not supposed to talk about and we're not supposed to consider. We look at some other actual photos of New Orleans and we see again the very well built out residential area with the beautiful bell towers and the other beautiful towers, and we look at all this effort that went into it. We're also well aware of the fact that New Orleans, based on its position with the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico and the surrounding waterways, is susceptible to flooding. Pretty much anyone who's been around longer than 10 years is well aware of what's happened with the hurricanes in the past, most notably Hurricane Katrina. Here we see another one of these pictures where we have the horses pulling the trolley, and we see this very well built out cobblestone roadway. And these pictures we're told are either from the 1890s to the 1920s. Of course, what's the actual time? You can always ask questions. Is this photo from the 1890s or is it from a later portion in time? Of course, when you see horses pulling the trolley, you'll automatically think, well, it must be from before the 1890s when they electrified the trolleys, as we just seem to have electricity go across the entire nation of the United States in a very rapid amount of time. Beautiful photos, though, and beautiful buildings, and look at this kind of detail. And when you compare the elaborate architecture and detail that went in this one building, and then look at the roadway around it, it's definitely the conflicting account that you see in the picture itself. It paints an entirely different picture from a city that we're told was around since 1718, but had to be rebuilt from a fire, because that's always the story. Isn't this interesting when you see these buildings here and the tracks in the road? And again, it goes back to the question, what came first, the tracks or the road? Here we have President McKinley addressing the august body of New Orleans in 1901 prior to his unfortunate assassination at the World's Fair in Buffalo. Very beautiful building, and yet it doesn't exactly look like what remains there today. There seem to be some subtle differences. And we see other gorgeous buildings, and how many of these buildings are still there in New Orleans and how many have unfortunately been torn down over the years. It seems to be a situation in many cities across the United States where you have certain buildings that seem to have survived and yet other ones that have not. And look at this very vast crowd here, and look at some of the buildings that we see with some of the beautiful towers. And look at the variance in the towers that you see. You've got bell towers, you've got some of the more traditional towers that we see, and unique designs. It's obvious, though, that there is nothing within this city that really escapes our attention to detail when we see these gigantic columns in this building. Very beautiful. And how long has it really been there? What was the original construction behind it? Well, New Orleans is known in the United States for the War of 1812, where we had General General Andrew Jackson, who led what was perhaps the greatest American victory of the War of 1812. And if you know anything about the official account of the War of 1812, the United States military didn't exactly perform well there. But we'll start by looking at our star forts around New Orleans. Fort Macomb and Fort Pike. Fort Pike is very well preserved, and Fort Macomb is not so well preserved, being grown over. However, it does show us that there are the presence of star forts in the New Orleans area. And we always suspect that star forts represent the previous civilization. Now here's Fort Macomb we'll look at first, and it's very well grown over, but yet you can still see the fine details and shapes, the geometric shapes that always accompany a star fort. And there's a lot of theories for what these smaller star forts may have represented. Were they drains, or were they some sort of valve control system? Here's Fort Pike, and we can see that it's much more well-maintained. And we go back to that theory of drains, and perhaps there's something to that with the fact that both these star forts are right on the entryway of the Mississippi going past New Orleans. Not sure, but it's very beautiful when you look at the geometric patterns, and the preservation on it's amazing. We'll be told by the official historical account, though, that these star forts were constructed from 1819 to 1824 because bricks were in abundant supply and transporting these things were no issue. Logistics was just not a problem in the 19th century. Even though you didn't have motor transportation at the time, railways supposedly were limited, and it was also very difficult in terms of logistically sustaining the workforce that would have been required, human and animal, to build such a structure. However, we go with the historical account, and it was only 5 years, and they managed to complete these amazing structures that stand today, even if they're grown over. Yes, they had cannons. Yes, they could defend it. And just look at the detail and the symmetry in this wall, and also pay attention to the ridges there near the top of it. It's quite an incredible image, and it reflects the fact that there seems to have been a previous civilization that was very obviously present in Louisiana. Well, anyway, that's enough star forts. Let's take a look at the city hell. What the hell is this? Brutalist architecture, 1950s building? This is the city hall? How did this get in the presentation? Who's responsible for this? Oh, there we go. Gallier Hall, built 1845 to 1853. The original city hall of New Orleans. And the unfortunate tragedy is we see that many of these beautiful old municipal buildings have been replaced by these lovely, and I say that in all sarcasm, brutalist architecture buildings of the 1950s and beyond. But here we see a more traditional, quote-unquote, neoclassical building with the columns and the pediment, and we can see that this is a very worthy city hall for any city anywhere in the world. So why exactly did they have to replace this one? Well, you'll find the usual slew of reasons that, well, it just wasn't meeting the needs at the time, it wasn't large enough, or they just didn't have enough rooms for people to sit around and wait for their bureaucratic processes to be completed. Very beautiful building, and very impressive that it was supposedly built in the mid-19th century, although we certainly question that. There's almost though there's something even more gorgeous about this particular pediment, and I can't quite put my finger on it. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments. I love the interiors too. Now, even though they're not using this as a city hall, we should be thankful that this building continues to survive. I love the interiors because while they may not be as well decorated, or at least putting as much artistic decoration in this building, it does give the impression though of the quality of this building. And you can get the feeling that this is a building where you would feel that relaxed, inspired feeling just walking in. And yet we still see some of the artistic beauty on the ceiling with the chandeliers and of course the usual checkerboard floor pattern. I also wonder how much of this has been due to the quote-unquote renovations that occur to where they're making this building appear, how shall we say, a little bit more modest on the inside than what was originally intended. I love the entryway here too with the columns and the doorway. Very, very large door, but you remember that saying from an LA story from Steve Martin, you're nobody in the city unless you have a very large door. And of course the old city hall had a very large door. I have a feeling the new one doesn't have a large door, but we're not going to look. Very beautiful. Look at this hallway. You can still see the signs of what a gorgeous building this was in its prime. And frankly, it's still in its prime. The fact that it's still standing and they haven't torn it down says a lot. Look at the pillars there integrated in the wall, the chandeliers, and the ceiling again, and of course the floor. You know, even the stairways, you can still see some of the details in the banister that survive, and that's something else to look for when you look at these old municipal buildings. I wonder if you could possibly enjoy being in the modern New Orleans City Hall as much as you would enjoy being in this building. Well, I'm sure there are some people who enjoy sitting around having their bureaucratic processes take all day, or several weeks, or months, depending on the case. This is another one of these rooms where you just get that feeling of beauty and decor, even though it looks a little bit modest by what we've seen in some of the other old world buildings. Well, let's move on to the Eleanor McMain Secondary School from 1932. This is an Art Deco secondary school. Now, we've only really seen one Art Deco school in Salt Lake City so far in the explorations on this channel. And I thought this one was interesting to consider as well because this building is still with us, but it's another building, unfortunately, that's fallen prey, if you will, to the Art Deco renovation. Now, we'll be told it's because they had to redo the building, they had to renovate it because it was so poorly made at the time that it just wasn't meeting the standards, and that's always when here you see it with some of this beautiful detail. And Art Deco is always interesting for that very reason. Look at some of these pillars and the beautiful ornate decorations on it. All for a school. And it's always intriguing when we consider the fact that these schools were so well adorned and so beautifully decorated. You could actually see this achieving the purpose of inspiring education. As though education was about how to think and not what to think. What to think being what's only in a book or what's cataloged in a book, and you have to abide by anything that's in a book. We like to think that books represent a time when information was more free and it was more open. But is that necessarily true? That's a fallacy of belief that we have to consider. It was a very beautiful building. And of course, we're told that it eroded over time. It started to deteriorate, as all these old world buildings that are somehow miraculously still standing do. And so therefore, they had to renovate it. And this is the renovation. Now, it's nice that the building's still standing, but you can get the feeling that there's something about the renovation that just doesn't quite feel right intuitively. It's almost as though I can hear this building crying out in its pain that this decoration just doesn't seem right. I mean, which one looks more beautiful to you? The interior, though, survives a little bit because we still have one of these beautiful auditoriums, and it looks like the ceiling of the auditorium has been unaltered, and you can see the area around the stage there. That's very gorgeous. I always love the auditoriums in these older schools. And what exactly are they telling us? That's something we have to consider. And now we go to the Hibernia Bank Building, built in 1921. So you could say this is Art Deco or a little pre-Art Deco, depending on what the design philosophy behind it was, or how they decided to designate the building. However, we see a very unique design with a beautiful building that's decorated. It has a pediment up top, and then there's even the little cupola up top. I wonder if that was originally a dome or something else. This is a rather unique building in the fact that we've seen other buildings like this. This somewhat reminds me of the layout of the Plummer Building in Rochester, Minnesota. However, it's unique and beautiful in its own way, especially with this cupola up top. Not a dome, but a little bit of a beehive pattern, it looks like. Hard to tell exactly. I even like the little parapet appearance there above the columns. Very, very unique. And even the pediment itself looks unique. And looking at it from different angles, we can see that no detail was spared. Again, in the 1920s, this was just no problem to throw up a building like this. And this is even before the time of Huey Long, the very famous governor of Louisiana. Ken Burns did a documentary on him too, by the way. And currently, this is apparently a residential complex, and I could see why this would be a beautiful pool to be swimming at, especially if you have that kind of background image with those beautiful pillars and the pediment there. You can see why that would be a very inspiring image. Although I decided to take a look at what renting a room in this building would be. It's a little pricey. Well, look at that column there and that beautiful decorative detail. And this is what one of those one-room apartments would look like, and if the prices are accurate, for the low price of $2,000 a month, you could rent yourself a one-bedroom apartment in the Hibernia building in New Orleans today. I don't know. I guess it's up to you to decide if it's worth it or not. I think you know where I sit on the matter. Now let's look at the Lakefront Airport. Started construction in 1929 and opened in the mid-1930s. This was supposedly at the orders of Governor Huey Long. What a beautiful airport. Imagine going to an airport like this every day. You know, we think of our modern experiences in airports and it's just nothing but hassle and difficulty. And yet just coming to this terminal, you'll say it's smaller, but look at the beautiful decorative detail. The very height of Art Deco buildings. I like all the images and the figures on the front of it. You know, you feel like you're actually going to ascend in the sky, and you can see why this would be an airport that people really want to go to. And then look at the interior of it with the ceiling and the walls and all the beautiful decoration. All this for an airport? I'm not complaining. I mean, I would love to have all of our airports look like this today. You would actually look forward to going to the airport. I have a feeling that the process that you have to go through in the airport would probably be more efficient too. Not that I'm saying that things in the past were better, but you know, at least from an aesthetic appearance, or at least from an aesthetic aspect, things looked a heck of a lot better. So I don't know, what do you think? How would you feel going to an airport like this every day? And of course, it's also used as a wedding venue, which, as I've joked in other videos, that's kind of our test to know if something's a true old world building. Well, you can get married in this airport, and apparently it's something that they push quite hard, and I can see why. It's very beautiful on the inside, and perfect place to have your reception. Still more detail, and you can see the ceiling a little bit better in this image, and this is definitely a building I would like to get to in person because I have a feeling it's another one of those buildings that gives you that feeling of being inspired on the inside and that it really speaks to your internal energy. Not quite seen an airport like this, you know. How would you get around unless you're going around the big, boring halls with the seats and something that looks like it was designed at the last minute and thrown together, sort of like O'Hare Airport or my personal favorite, LAX. Yeah, LAX. Less said about that, the better. Ursuline Academy, founded in 1727, and this speaks to the French Catholic heritage of New Orleans, as we're told. Another beautiful castle building that was originally used as both a convent. They had several buildings that were part of the convent. It's a very conflicting account. Surprise, surprise. The beautiful building that stands today, though, gives us that impression of the castle. And of course, it has to be 3 floors. It has to have very beautiful, well-decorated windows and towers and all the other trappings that we've come to expect on these old world buildings. And here's the chapel portion of it, and this is very beautiful. The interior photos, though, of this building, it looked like it's been renovated quite a bit. So probably a lot of details that have been lost over time or by whatever powers that be. However, the interior beauty of the chapel is quite incredible, and you can see it with the columns there and the beautiful altar. Always something that's amazing in terms of what survives where, and people will just go with the regular explanation, well, it's a church, that's how it's supposed to look. And now let's take a look at the St. Charles hotels. This was the 3rd St. Charles hotel. Don't worry, we'll be looking at the first 2 in due time, but I thought we'd start with the 3rd one because this is the end of the 19th century, and this is a very beautiful hotel. And we have limited pictures of it, but you can see the entryway to it. Yeah, not pulling up your car there, but pulling up your horse and buggy and getting ready to check in. You know, they have the bellhops to help you carry in your luggage from the back of your horse-drawn cart. And again, look at the cobblestone road there. Beautiful entryway, though. And we do have some pictures of the interior. And remember, this is the 3rd St. Charles Hotel, and we see very beautiful columns and the beautiful, well-adorned skylights in the ceiling. And of course, you even see it with the banisters and the handrails. No details spared. And it looks like this would be an incredibly beautiful place to stay in the end of the 19th century, as though you would feel very relaxed, and this truly has a resort feel to it. Compare and contrast this with the modern hotels that we have. Yeah, I'm not thinking you're going to get this experience at the Holiday Inn Express. I mean, maybe you will. But here you see it again with the pillars and the floor, and of course the ceiling as well. I'm just astounded by the fact that there were 3 St. Charles hotels that were told in New Orleans in the 19th century, and that this was the 3rd one that was supposedly constructed in the 1890s. You'll never guess how the previous 2 were lost to us. Look at this. You really get the feeling for the skylight here. And this is the kind of beauty, these are the sort of things that I enjoy seeing in these old buildings. And of course, we don't have the St. Charles Hotel anymore, because why would anybody want this kind of luxury or this kind of experience staying in a hotel? It's interesting to me, though, how this is cataloged and how many of our modern integral journal sources still keep these pictures and still refer to this as a very beautiful building. So even the mainstream seems to agree with our aesthetic appraisal. And here is the first St. Charles Hotel. Unfortunately, it was lost in a fire. Of course. Always the fires that just seem to strike very specific buildings, except for the other fires that strike more wide areas. And I'm sure we're given some story that I'm not going to look up. Here's the Touro Synagogue, early 20th century. Haven't really featured many synagogues on the channel, but this is a very beautiful building with an incredible dome, and for some reason I'm reminded of the Pantheon in Rome. But this is very gorgeous, and it looks like this building has survived today, although I'd like to get on the ground and verify some things with it. And look at the beautiful large-scale window and the way it's laid out. It's not a traditional design, and yet in some other respects it is. Interior photos for this were a little hard to come by, and I couldn't really verify if this is the actual interior of the Touro Synagogue, but it looks like it is. And look at some of the beautiful columns there and the interior. And you even have a pediment on the interior. So again, no detail spared. Some of these surviving buildings that harken back to an earlier civilization. And let's look at the St. Louis Cathedral, founded in 1720. Yes, I'm doing that intentionally because I've got to get back at Christopher Lambert for making fun of my French pronunciations or lack of capability in pronouncing French pronunciations. This is one of the most iconic buildings of New Orleans, though, the St. Louis Cathedral. And supposedly the towers have been renovated and changed many different times. And you see the central tower and the 2 subsidiary towers. Originally, they supposedly weren't pointed. They were a little bit more rounded. And yet you see the columns in the front facade and the buildings around it with a pediment on it. And I think this reflects the original old world identity that still survives to this day from New Orleans. And I think this is one of the reasons why New Orleans is one of the most incredible examples of a true old world city. Yes, you might have noticed they've tried to conceal it by building new buildings, such as the lovely current City Hall from the 1950s. But so much of it still endures. And looking at the interior of this cathedral, we're just struck by the incredible beauty. We're struck by the fact that the ceiling is so well decorated, and this building is so unbelievably old. Yet it's been renovated and changed and rebuilt many times. But how old is it really? And I'm still wondering, in the design and construction of it, you don't really see many other cathedrals like it, at least in the United States. But of course people say, well, it's because they were inspired by the decoration in Europe. Of course they were. Here's a little bit of a video from it, and just looking up at the ceiling, you can see the incredible arcs and all the columns and detail with it. And of course the checkerboard floor seems to be a recurring pattern. We had a cotton expo in New Orleans in 1884 to 1885, another one of our great World's Fairs, and no shortage of questionable or conflicting events with it as well. I mean, look at that beautiful large building there. Are we going to be told that that was a temporary structure built with sticks and sucker sticks and lollipops and balsa wood and stucco? Part of a slew of World's Fairs that was going on at that time, and people have asked me if I'm aware that there were always World's Fairs going on all over the world in the 19th century, and yes, I'm aware of it, which makes it even more interesting. Why is it that there seemed to be such a push for this, and yet today when you go to a fair, you'll be lucky to see some tents and the existing wooden buildings that have always been there? The Cotton Expo, though, was no exception to the World's Fairs, because we have the usual very large, magnificent building that seems to be the center point, but then a lot of other subsidiary buildings, and of course we'll be told that millions of people descended upon this World's Affair because traveling in the 19th century was no problem. Yes, I said World's Affair because I think that's a more appropriate term for this. And what exactly is going on with these displays? Are we really seeing the aspects of the cotton industry in the 19th century, or are we seeing something else? So we can look at the official accounts, but when we look at the pictures, we always seem to have a conflicting account with what we're told. Very, very beautiful, and showcasing the supposed wonderful industrial capability of the South in the United States. And keep in mind that this was only 20 years after the U.S. Civil War, and New Orleans was featured quite prominently in the Civil War, as it was considered the main gateway to the Mississippi, which, given its geographic location, makes perfect sense. Not exactly sure what's going on with this little gazebo building here as this little display. This doesn't look like any sort of temporary structure, and I thought it was interesting to highlight. What do you think this is? What exactly are these columns or these pillars with it? And you see little arches in it. I'm not really sure what to make of this. Actual photos of this expo are very difficult to come by, but this is supposedly one of the photos of the main building. And that's right, made out of your balsa wood and your leftover popsicle sticks, no problem. So easy to construct and so easy to tear down, because we just had all the time and resources in the 19th century and no logistical limitations. And now we're going to look at Aurelian's lost building list, starting with the Church of Messiah in 1853. All these buildings that we're going to be looking at now are no longer with us, but they did exist in New Orleans according to the official account, and we have pictures. And what a beautiful building. Very gorgeous, and again, something unique when it comes to the design and construction of religious buildings. The Parish Prison, 1834. Very nice prison. Although I think of the one that we saw in Anamosa, Iowa, while it may not compare completely to that, it's still very impressive with a little cupola over there. And why do you need that on a prison? Very interesting. First Presbyterian, 1857. And look at the tower on that beauty. It's a real tragedy that this building's still not with us, because it's a religious building, and you'd like to think that we venerate religious figures and we have a respect for religion, although you'll find interesting historical accounts where that's not always the case, especially in the United States in the 19th century. We always have the Protestants going at the Catholics and vice versa. The first St. Charles Hotel, built in 1835. Look at this gorgeous building. This looks like a state capitol. And of course, this is one that was lost to fire. Beautiful dome, columns all over the place, and the beautiful pediment. It was stated that this is one of the most beautiful buildings in the United States at the time. Of course, that's the official account. And who knows what the ground truth reality is. Still, a hotel. They're saying this was a hotel in the 19th century. Imagine if we could get a hotel built like this today. Well, this one vanished by fire. supposedly 1850s, so they replaced it with this one, the second St. Charles Hotel. Looks just like the first one, minus the dome on top. So what's really going on here? Again, another conflicting account. I'm not sure what to make of this. The second St. Charles Hotel, though, was actually used during the Civil War as the headquarters of the military governor of New Orleans, and that's Major General Benjamin Butler. Yes, Benjamin Butler, who was the military governor, dictator of New Orleans during the Civil War. And he had some very controversial policies, although his authoritarian and oppressive leadership style did help reduce the outbreak of fever in New Orleans, which it was supposedly susceptible to. This guy looks kind of familiar. He almost looks like someone took actor Dennis Franz and melted him in the microwave for a few minutes. I have to wonder if Benjamin Butler ever served in some sort of official capacity as the governor of Wisconsin, or perhaps the mayor of Madison. His authoritarian policies would go very popular there. What's he wearing there? Is that supposed to be some kind of uniform? That's very interesting. Where have I seen that before? Oh yeah, those dress uniforms in Star Trek The Next Generation. I was wondering where they got that idea from. Quick, number one, put on your butler uniform. Luxana Troy is coming again. All right, back on topic. French Opera House, 1910. And again, we see the surrounding roadways there, and we always have these opera houses that seem to be in every large city and small town across the United States from the 19th century. Everybody needed to have an opera house. Even if your town only had 300 people, you needed to have an opera house. You weren't getting in the stagecoach and riding over to the nearby town. Oh no, you had to have the opera house there. How could you even have enough acts to go around all these opera houses? Gilbert Academy, 1888. Look at the tower on that. That's very unique. And of course, the central construction there. You know, if this was in another state, we'd probably be told this is a school for the blind or a school for the deaf, because, you know, if there's one thing blind people need to help them get around, it's multiple floor buildings. Yes, don't question that one. And the Horticulture Hall, one of the remnants, lost buildings from the Cotton Exposition, or the Centennial Exposition, or whatever name you want to assign to it. Very beautiful building. And again, something else that unfortunately we've lost because of the natural progression, the renewal as we'll call it, in the United States. The Inn Terminal, 1902, very interesting. And we have this large, what looks to be a hangar. Of course, we'll be told that this is just a cover area for a train station. Wonder why this one was lost. Very interesting tower. And, you know, you need to have a 3 or 4 floor tower so you can actually run a proper train station, I guess. Well, let me know in the comments what you think this building really is, because I always enjoy hearing your opinions on it, because I think you're very accurate with some of your impressions. And now looking at the Moresque building, built in 1859, but they had to stop it during the Civil War, and I guess Benjamin Butler was not giving any authoritarian or oppressive orders to continue construction on this building, but they managed to complete it right after the Civil War. Very unique and very beautiful. And what architectural style does this represent, I wonder? Not something that we see a lot of. The Public Library in 1908. Yes, little dome there, pediment in the columns. You know, the only public library I've seen that really matches this one in bizarre factor has to be the one I looked at in La Crosse, Wisconsin, way back in one of the early explorations, the one that looked like it was lifted from some sort of fairy tale. And I like, again, how you have the stairs that go up to the main entrance. So why don't all public libraries still look like this today? Not sure. The Orleans Parish Criminal Courts, 1880s. And look at that beautiful clock tower and numerous towers on that. Well, of course you need a court building that looked like that at the time. It gives all the people that are coming in there to have their judgments read to them the feeling that they're going into a building that reflects authority. And of course you have a large clock tower on it at the time. And people tell me, well, it's so people could check their time, because nobody had pocket watches in the 19th century. Got a video coming up on that as well. The second Masonic Temple, built in 1892. Wonder what the first one looked like. Again, no detail spared there with the beautiful large windows and the incredible towers. Again, many different architectural styles, and you know, for this particular exploration, I'm not so concerned about what they're labeling these as, whether it's Gothic, Victorian Revival, Imperial, or whatever. Southern Rail Depot, 1908. Look at the intricacy with this one. And you see some of these large mason stones and the interesting foundation, and then look at the front window on this. This isn't exactly the kind of building that I'm certainly used to seeing. Very unique. A railway depot that looks like that. And the Touro Shakespeare Almshouse, 1882. Almshouse was basically the way they said poorhouse. And of course you need a very well-built and unique poorhouse or almshouse with the large portal windows. And looks like it's 3 floors. I wonder what the foundation's like, and I wonder how deep in the foundation it really goes. Very intriguing. And Temple Sinai, built 1872. 1872. Gorgeous building like this being built in New Orleans. Very tragic that we don't have this building to still go see, because I would love to see the interior of this, and I could not find any interior photos of this beautiful building. But what do you think of it? Well, that concludes our exploration of New Orleans, and as General Charlton Heston, Andrew Jackson said, we have an incredible city here, and he successfully defended it in the War of 1812, one of the few American victories from that war. I wonder, am I going to be lampooned for my poor pronunciation of French words for the rest of my life? Thanks for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.